All right.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about why radio is the most overlooked growth channel for brands looking to expand into the U.S. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Pat. I would love to have an intro here.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Pat Schmidt. I am the VP of Partnerships for Podcscribe. I was going to just talk a little bit about that, but I guess quick show of hands, who here has heard of Podcscribe?
Oh.
Okay, that's actually pretty good.
That's pretty good, yeah.
Better than I was expecting. For those of you who haven't, Podcscribe is an omni-channel ad tech solution that specializes in verification, attribution, and research. The name, as would indicate, is we do a lot in the podcast space, but that's not the only channel that we measure, as we're going to talk about today.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pat. And I'm Grant Durando. I'm a director of the offline practice at Right Side Up, where we manage in-house programs for podcast advertising, radio advertising, satellite radio, streaming audio, and YouTube endorsement. Right Side Up is a broader company, generally places fractional talent in fractional roles, driven by subject matter expertise in particular areas of marketing. But for today, the topic's radio. I wanted to start with a stat that just always surprises me. 90% of adults 18 plus in the US are reached by radio on a weekly basis. I think that's a big misconception of marketers and the general public of, radio's kind of old and a little bit dusty and maybe not hitting those primetime consumers of, 18 to 34 or 18 to 45. Pat, do you see that in the marketplace, that misconception?
Absolutely. I don't think I'm alone here. I'm always surprised by that statistic as well. I think, in the day and age when we come to these conferences and you can't go 5 minutes without AI being brought up, the thought of radio feels antiquated. But the fact of the matter is, it really is a substantial part of audio in general, especially in the United States. The reach, the scale it provides, there's so many benefits. And to your point, it's often overlooked for more digital-centric channels, and I think that's a big mistake for a lot of advertisers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we, kind of just take for granted how easy it is for consumers to access radio, right? If you're in the car, that's kind of what comes on by default. If you walk into a store, oftentimes that's going to be kind of the background. If you jump into a taxi, right, you're going to be hearing a lot of terrestrial radio, and maybe after this panel, you'll notice it a little bit more in your everyday life. But with that, wanted to kind of talk about who is the right fit for radio advertising from an ICP perspective? And I think, from our perspective, marketers who are looking for anyone, 18 plus, and especially performance-focused marketers. It makes a lot of sense to look into radio. Given kind of the work that you guys are doing at Podcscribe with modeling, what are you seeing in the early data that you're getting back in terms of what that ICP should be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point, brands who are looking to achieve results are kind of, I think, the prime candidates. And I think we've seen that for a long time. Traditionally, the way it was done was radio, you're able to basically get really good scale. It tends to be incredibly efficient. The CPMs make it much easier to achieve that effectiveness through the efficiency. But for a long time, it lacked, sort of, I would say, a more modern approach to measuring the performance. But we've kind of managed to change that, honestly. I think we are, kind of excited to be able to show in a more granular way how those ads in radio are impacting a brand's performance metrics.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think that brands looking for kind of bottom funnel performance should be looking at radio, top funnel? Where should radio fit in the mix?
Yeah, totally. I think you can actually do both. And I say that because obviously for all the reasons that we just mentioned, the bottom funnel makes tons of sense, right? It's highly efficient. You're able to get frequency that drives action, right? That's kind of some of the tenets of radio. On the flip side, it really is a mass reach medium as well, too, right? So you can go and you can hit things on a national basis. There's also, I would say, the way that the creative is constructed gives you a lot of license to be able to kind of tell a story about a brand. So for brands looking to kind of describe who they are, some of their benefits, the actual creative itself is actually quite powerful. It's better than when you're trying to scroll through and just hope somebody catches the idea of a product just from your feed, that's a little tricky to get that point across. But when you have a host or somebody that can take a little bit of time to talk about a product, the benefits, that's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an interweave too between kind of the tactics of creative and the tactics of buying. And so to kind of hit into that tactical layer a bit, when you're buying terrestrial radio in the US, you have a couple of different options in terms of targeting. So you can do a national buy. That's exactly what it sounds like. It hits all of the radio stations across a given, publisher network. And it might air at different drop times in different cities and this kind of thing. But generally speaking, you're getting an extremely efficient CPM, talking like single digits, right? Sorry for any radio publishers in the room to spill the beans on that one. But single digit CPMs, highly efficient, very big reach. On the flip side of that is a local targeting strategy. So this often focuses around DMAs or designated market areas, and allows you to kind of do regional messaging, right? And this is where the interplay comes in, of highlighting particular markets from a regional level, or even at a city level. Is there other color you've seen on that?
Yeah, I was going to kind of expand upon that. I think that local approach also leads to the authenticity aspect, right? I mean, I think we all know that when there's a product you hear or see that resonates with you, whether it's something that's relevant to you or is around you, you're much more aware of it. And I think that's one of the benefits of being able to really hit people with local radio messaging as well.
Yeah, it definitely kind of stops them in their tracks of like, oh, this feels personalized to me. And I think in a world that's kind of somewhere between a Super Bowl commercial and then like a hyper-personalized algorithmic feed, just dripping you personalized advertising that you somehow managed to avoid anyway. I think radio plays a nice role in that middle ground.
Yeah, I like that. I think we've all heard and seen the ads that are maybe a little too personalized. You're like, whoa, I just talked about that, or I just researched that product. And I think, being able to speak to something in your hometown as you're driving through town is that nice middle ground.
Yep, definitely. And, again, tactically, just for folks interested in executing in this channel, we divide the types of spots into a couple of different categories. So we think about live, voiced, and branded. That's generally the terminology used in the US. Live is going to be that host-read endorsement, usually in most cases. This is going to be stitched into the content really organically, and maybe barely sound like an ad at all. Those are going to go for the highest premium. Perhaps, obviously, they create the most value. Secondly, we have voice. That's borrowing that host's voice, but then utilizing it in a pre-recorded run. So this gives the publishers some operational efficiency in terms of like placing those ads on a like mechanical level, which then translates into more efficient pricing. But you get to carry the tailwinds of the host endorsement or the host voice as well. And then lastly, branded, which is, basically doing pre-recorded spots. A lot of companies in the US like to do founder spots, for example. You guys are probably familiar with that in the D2C space. Hi, I'm the founder of X company. The reason I built this was to, inevitably cut out the middleman of something, and get the product to use cheaper. So
yeah, and I think the cool thing about all those types of creative executions is that they inherently bring, we kind of talked about the relevance associated with local marketing. I think in the way that these ads are constructed, it brings about a level of trust, right? People listen to a particular radio station or a DJ because they like them. That's their sort of, there's a little bit of a comfort level there. So when the host then speaks to a brand, it brings with it that level of trust. It's kind of the same thing we talk about in podcasts, et cetera. So I think that's a really important thing to basically, showcase as well. And the same thing goes with like the founder of a company, right? You feel like you're getting this authenticity that you don't find in a lot of other mediums.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we're here talking about radio at the Business of Podcasting room, right? It dovetails really well with that strategy of how do we, borrow voices that are trusted, that are loved and adored for 30 seconds and just take that relationship and build our brand on top of it. And I think that's the magic of audio, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if any of you were in the prior talk with Flight Story, they talked about sort of the value that creators bring. And I think it is along that same lines of trust and authenticity. And, I think the other thing we'll also just say, like, as we're, sort of espousing some of the benefits of radio here, I think it's always important to step back and realize that we are positioning this as radio is a really important part of the strategy. We're not saying it's necessarily the whole strategy, right? It's a great piece of the pie, but obviously, and it works really well in conjunction with your digital, with podcasts, et cetera. And so I think that's kind of an important thing we want to say. It's not necessarily, we see benefits in all sorts of different marketing channels, but radio just has a lot of benefits that people often overlook.
And when you start talking about channel mix, you have to ask about measurement. And that's what brings Podcscribe and Right Side Up together. We actually co-developed a measurement tool that's first in class and best in class to basically emulate digital style tracking for terrestrial radio. The reason why we did this, I was working with a lot of brands at Right Side Up on podcast advertising. We're the largest independent buyers of podcast ads in the world. And all of them said, I want more podcasts. Oh, let's do that. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, we should do radio too, right? And they said, oh, you can't track it with a Pixel, so I can't run it. It has to be consistent with my tech stack. Worked with Podcscribe to develop what's very exciting. And we'll see if this will work. Nope. Okay.
Well, if it did work.
Well, if it did work, you can imagine behind me this amazing stack.
Oh. Let's see. One more click.
There we go.
There we go. A little low.
Radio attribution.
Yeah.
So the nuts and bolts of this is that we utilize pixel-based attribution in a spike level analysis model in order to track radio from spot being aired to conversion happening on your app or website. Pat, would you like to take it away here and talk a little bit more about the benefits?
Yeah, absolutely. So Grant kind of nailed it. This is sort of, I think it's a pretty big step forward for radio advertising in general. To his point, we tried to kind of take something that was somewhat slow and sort of both bring it forward, give it a more digital look and feel to be able to be comparable to your digital channels, but also pick up the pace of what we can report against. Instead of having to go and run a campaign, wait a bunch of time to see what the impact was, and oftentimes with a lot of radio measurement, it was like, hey, you attribute any conversion that happened within an 8-minute window of the ad dropping. We try to take a little more of a sophisticated approach, understand the baseline, see what happens when these ads deliver in these particular markets, and then understand the impact of that advertising, giving you a little bit more granularity and a little more speed.
A little more speed, I would say a lot more speed.
Yeah.
The way that we tested this tool to see if it was working is we took some of our biggest clients spending millions of, 1 million plus per month per client on radio in the US, at least 6 months of data. The typical way of measuring this was through a mixed media modeling system. These tools require vast amounts of, one, money, they're very expensive. And then two, you have to put 3 months of data in, wait 2 months, and then get the reporting out. That's 5 months. Digital media shouldn't take that long. Marketing can't take that long. We were able to get weekly reporting that lined up with the MMM model to a tune of 5%. So what that all means, all those words and acronyms, is we had a trusted source of attribution that took 5 months to get. We used Podcscribe's radio attribution tool and developed weekly reporting to get that top line CPA or performance number that was consistent with the 5-month model, which I think is great.
Yeah, and I think the amount of data cuts that it provides are really great as well too, and it allows marketers the chance to be able to ultimately understand what's going on and then make optimizations accordingly. And to Grant's point, you don't have to wait 5 months. So we're minimizing the waste that's associated with having to kind of test and learn through radio.
Yeah, and I know we're adding features and cuts all the time, it feels like, but do you have like a favorite cut of data that we're using right now?
I would say one or two. So the one I like the most is, candidly, it's the one that I get a lot of kind of eyebrow raises when we present, which is the heat map. And let's see I think we have a picture of that somewhere in here. There it is. Yeah, and I think it's just because this is really both easy to understand, but it's also pretty functional. So if you're all of a sudden running a national campaign and you start to see that a particular state is doing very well, but there's particular markets that aren't doing well or vice versa, it really gives you some logical next steps in terms of where you can either invest additional dollars or sort of how to kind of craft your marketing strategy moving forward. So that's a really good one. I think the other one I will say is it was on an earlier slide. We also try to kind of just bubble up some of the highlights at the top because, it's one thing to provide a lot of data. It's another thing to provide the actual insights, which is always better, right? So when you first log in to the screen, it'll tell you kind of the top and bottom for like the geos and the stations and the genres as well too, which I think is great to be able to just have that key information, front and center when you first log in.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, in that MMM model that we were using before, we did not get cuts for station. We did not get cuts for creative. We got cuts for DMA, but it was across an entire marketing portfolio. So we didn't know if that was paid social, like Meta, driving those, hot spots and slow spots, or if it was terrestrial radio and we should optimize that way. So for me, a reporting tool is only as good as the action you can take with it. And what's really nice about Podcscribe as their reporting tool is that we built it with the buying levers in mind. So when you look at this heat map, if you see areas like, Los Angeles and San Francisco, presumably is those big green blobs, you can actually just start refining your radio buy to focus in on those areas versus, just kind of looking at it and being like, that's interesting. I'll put that in a deck and not do anything about
we always
it.
kind of joke. The great state of Texas down here is in kind of an orange, just not looking so well. But if you look at some of the markets like around, I think it's Austin, Dallas, maybe down the bottom there, that's a great logical next step for a local radio buy, right?
So with this tool that's, completely shaken our business in a positive way and hopefully yours too.
Absolutely.
How do you think about brands when they ask you, what sets the winners and losers in radio apart? You now have this kind of bird's eye view on performance in terrestrial radio. And so I'm wondering, are there kind of clear signs or characteristics where, you might forewarn?
In terms of like what makes what's the best strategy for implementing this, or what's the?
In terms of if a brand came to you and said, hey, you're seeing all this Podcscribe radio data, am I a winner or am I a loser based on kind of what you're seeing and what you know about my brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the biggest wins we're seeing are the brands that can take the data and be actionable with it. That's I would say, one of the kind of, the ones that can actually go take the data and make changes, and I think that's the biggest thing, right? Because we can cut the data in so many different ways that give insights into how people should craft their strategy. Those are the ones that I think are really coming out ahead with this dashboard.
Amazing. And I'm curious, I don't think I've ever asked you this question actually. How do radio publishers feel about this tool, and what's the general consensus on the media side? I sit very clearly on the buy side, so I'm curious.
Yeah, it's been pretty positive so far, if I'm honest. We haven't had any negative feedback, so to speak. I think it's more about how we actually get this done. Oftentimes we require like post logs to be able to get the data in, but it's more sort of just figuring out the right way to get all the data inputs. But in general, they see it as a way to kind of invigorate and continue to sell through the value of their inventory, which I think they're really appreciative of. It kind of is giving a little bit of a second wind to a lot of radio buying.
Amazing. Are you layering in, it wouldn't be a panel in 2026 without talking about AI, right? So are you layering in any AI on the modeling aspects of this, or are there plans to incorporate that in the future?
Yeah, so we do it in a couple different ways. Absolutely, in terms of how we're looking at the data and sort of how we're, sort of rolling the sort of logs into where the sort of impact is being felt. The other thing is also when it comes to our air checks as well too. So we just released air checks in conjunction with this.
Can you define air checks?
Yes.
Please?
So that's essentially when someone tells you that an ad is run, you're going to get a big old spreadsheet full of it ran this time. But then what an air check is it's actually the recording of it. So you can go and hear that. And oftentimes for a lot of publishers, it's a little bit of an arduous task to go and gather that up and deliver it. We have it all incorporated directly into the dashboard. So I think it allows advertisers to feel comfortable that they know the ad ran, and they can also hear how it sounded. So especially if you have a host that's kind of off and running with it, they want to hear what this host actually said and kind of get a sense of the creative.
Do you offer transcriptions for those too?
Yeah, we do.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
So, as a marketer, I'm sitting here listening to this and I'm thinking, wow, I could probably build my own AI agent that could download all, and by the way, what I love about Podcscribe, all of this data is CSV exportable.
Yeah.
I could pull all of this in, grab the transcriptions from the air checks as well, and then basically have this as an always-on agentic process that analyzes my radio spots, analyzes all of the performance data and all the cuts I have time for, and all the cuts I would never look at because you know, I'm only human. And then basically have it spit out a performance report for me on what are the top 5 things I need to do this week to change my CAC 5% more positively in the next week. And I think that's like the power of performance marketing in 2026, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, we've just talking about sort of the transcription process, as the name would imply, Podcscribe. We started out transcribing podcasts. One of the sort of core pillars of what we do is exactly that. So we do air checks for podcast ads, and it's we not only transcribe them, but then we score them based on some traits that we see around sort of, you know, positive performing attributes for a podcast ad. So that's going to be obviously coming to radio as well. But just that's kind of the, you know, another great tool that we sort of have implemented as well using AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, here you are, you're a marketer, maybe thinking about launching in the US or bringing your UK or EU based business into the US, or just expanding your brand awareness or deep funnel conversion presence. You're thinking about podcasts because it feels like everyone has one and it's all marketers talk about. God bless them, because it's my career. Yeah. But you know, you're also thinking about, how am I going to reach the consumers who have never heard of a podcast or don't have time for that, right? Yeah. And I think terrestrial radio really deserves to be on the map, pun intended here.
Absolutely.
You know, based on the ability to measure in a digital style way. I have 20 more questions for you, but with a couple of minutes left, I did want to open it up to see if there's any questions in the audience that would love to be asked.
Yeah. Are there any radio buyers in the room?
Not yet.
Oh.
Give them a couple weeks.
Just, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Well, another burning question for me is, this tool is really exciting in its current state, but it's brand new. I mean, we got out of beta, in October or something like this?
Yeah.
So what does 2 years from now look like in this product?
Yeah, I think you'll see, first of all, the data cuts continue to get sort of more and more granular. I mean, it's great right now, but it's pretty high level. If you compare it to what we have on the podcast side of the house, it's not nearly as granular. So I think will be really great to be able to see that. I think I can only imagine the speed is going to continue to increase as well, which will be great too. It's great. It's way faster than what we had previously, but I think, you know, what's one thing we really pride ourselves on is always evolving sort of the speed with which we can, you know, produce results and insights.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I look forward to kind of the feedback loop continuing. Yeah. I do think that there's a future, you know, maybe 18 to 24 months where data like this gets pumped back in direct to the publishers and, you know, kind of bypasses the service layer where Right Side Up would sit, but allows for advertisers to get more efficient optimization that doesn't have to go to the filter of you know, Grant, you know, slowing things down, basically.
Yeah, that's the dream for sure.
Yeah, totally. All right, excellent. Any last questions from the audience here? No? Amazing. Well, thank you all for joining us on this panel today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cool.